Okay, we are live. Welcome everyone to this session. You'll remember the late Professor Thandika Mkandawire. Thandika was the inaugural chair of African development at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and yesterday marked 1 year since his passing. Today, we want to use this opportunity to reflect on Thandika's legacy, and we'll shortly be hearing from our speaker, Dr. Eyob Balcha Gebremariam, who will share some words to reflect on his life. It is important that I introduce Eyob before handing over to him. Dr. Eyob is a fellow at the LSE, and he holds his PhD in development policy and management from the University of Manchester. And his areas of interest include African political economy, politics of development, and young people in politics and citizenship. Eyob also a Matassa Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex in 2016. And he has been teaching primarily African political economy and African development at the International Development Department at LSE since October 2017. With that being said, Eyob, the floor is yours, and we're excited to hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. This is the most thrilling and humbling experience for me to speak at this summit commemorating Professor Thandika Mkandawire. And I thank the organizers for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share my reflection about Thandika's success and to celebrate his achievements. The first time I came across the name Thandika Mkandawire was when I read a book entitled Our Continent, Our Future, African Perspectives on Star Child Adjustment Programs. The book was co-edited by Thandika and Charles Soludo, and it was back in 2007 that I read this book. As a young Pan-Africanist, I was thrilled and excited to have found a book that speaks both to my passion and my intellectual desire. Exactly after 7 years, in September 2014, I found myself in the same conference room with Thandika in Manchester. During the coffee break, I introduced myself to him as an Ethiopian PhD student, and his immediate response was to tease me because Ethiopia just lost to Malawi in a football match a few days ago. His response made me feel quite comfortable to engage with him more passionately. I will make my final preparation to return to Ethiopia for my fieldwork after spending a year at the University of Manchester. My focus was on the Ethiopian developmental state, and Thandika's extensive and deep knowledge on the topic gave us an interest to continue our conversation. I stuck with him, I would say, during the lunch break and continued to learn from his observations. He was quite friendly, and I felt extremely relaxed around him. Thandika was very passionate when he shared with me his experience of debating with the late Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, the architect of the Ethiopian aspiring developmental region. Thandika's departure is not only a loss of a beloved scholar and a father-like colleague for me. His absence has also created quite a huge void in the throne of knowledge and intellectual pursuit on the topics of African economic development and political economy. Thandika's authority and excellence on a variety of issues that span from social policy to the challenge of democratic politics, from developmental states to resource mobilization and taxation, from agriculture to social movements, from the intellectual history of African scholars to debates on structural adjustment programs, makes him a uniquely qualified African social scientist to comment on a wide variety of topics concerning our beloved Africa. With his historically grounded reflection, empirically rigorous observation, and unparalleled Pan-African conviction. Thandika was an African scholar par excellence. We may not be surprised if an economist is extraordinarily good in his or her field of study, because that's what most economists aspire to be. Similarly, we may not be amazed if a sociologist or historian is quite an accomplished scholar in her field. What we see in Thandika's intellectual journey is an astonishingly inter- and multidisciplinary excellence in explaining the challenge of socioeconomic and political development in Africa. His training as a development economist is just one area of excellence, meshed with an edifying knowledge of history and all-round expertise in politics and political processes, unparalleled understanding of the interplay among socioeconomic sectors, such as agriculture, taxation, social policy, gender, trade, and the like. This is why I would say Thandika's departure made us experience the famous African proverb in real time. When an old person dies, a library burns to the ground. Thandika was a walking library with a heartwarming and positively infectious personality. The second time I met Thandika in person was at a day-long conference organized at the LSE by colleagues at the International Development Department, Dr. Laura Mann, and former fellow at the same department, Dr. Behurai, on 15th May 2017. I was nearly done with my dissertation, which means I had more to talk to him at the coffee break. It was very unlikely for him to remember me, of course. So I reintroduced myself, reminded him of our lengthy discussion when we first met, and we continued our conversation about the Ethiopian developmental state, the potential and feasibility of democratic developmentalism, and the peculiar features of the Ethiopian model. Once again, in our conversation, he mentioned that he truly enjoyed his debate with Meles Zenawi. Thandika strongly believed that his ideas have influenced Meles Zenawi's thinking and practice of development statism. I definitely agree. But I'm not sure Thandika would ever endorse Meles's authoritarian approach. Indeed, the Ethiopian developmental state model attempted to establish the ideology structure nexus that Thandika talks about to pursue accelerated economic growth and development. There are undeniable and remarkable success stories, but also major failures. The learning process can go in any direction depending on the political context. I will say more about this later, but perhaps one of the most important points that Thandika would highlight is the conviction that the Ethiopian model has demonstrated in the possibility of developmentalism. The determination of the trial and error to get the puzzle of development unlocked, and rather than to remain at the mercy of the Bretton Woods institutions. After our second meeting, I never expected that I would return to the LSE almost a month and a half later after attending the conference to attend a job interview, and I became a colleague of this beloved person, Professor Thandika Mkandawire. After I joined the International Development Department in October 2017, it was another experience for me in my post-PhD life. Exciting, very thrilling. The fact that both of us were not living in London and a number of other factors means we couldn't manage to meet in person for almost a year after I joined LSE. In the 2018-19 academic year, I was a program director for the MSc program in African development and the convener for the African Political Economy course. Thandika was co-convening the other core course of the program, African Development, with Dr. Laura Mann. One day in November 2018, I received an email from him asking, "Are you on campus today?" Luckily, I was in and we scheduled a meeting that day. He said he would come to my office because his office was being used by another person that day. So I welcomed him to my office. Welcoming Africa's foremost development and political economist to my office was quite a thrilling experience. We had nearly a 2 hours long discussion. The discussion touched a number of topics. We continued our discussion on Ethiopia, and I updated him with more details about the impasse of developmental statism in the Ethiopian context. He raised a number of questions which helped me to think more about the challenge of the Ethiopian model. Thandika also shared with me his advice about how I need to broaden my study. Despite being immersed in our conversation, I remember taking a moment and letting myself to experience the surreal feeling that I had that I had whilst having an interrupted conversation with someone that I hugely respect and look up to. He talked to me like a father, giving advice about how my strategy should be to continue thriving in academic world, to learn and to read a wide range of materials, and daring to teach on different subjects. Most importantly, he encouraged me to remain assertive and conscious of the structural manifestations of otherization, micro and subtle aggressions of academic environment because of my identity and my skin color. Even though I did not have the full profile of my department's academic staff members by that time, I think it was only Thandika and me who were the only two Black African academics in our department, a seasoned professor and an early career aspiring scholar. In the 2018-19 academic year, which I believe was the last academic year that Thandika was actively involved in teaching, we continued our conversation on a number of issues. We never stopped talking about the Ethiopian model, its drawbacks, its success, and his plan to study it in detail. The last time we met was, I believe, on one late afternoon of February 2019. After a lengthy discussion in his office, we went to Garrick to grab a bite. Almost every conversation we had on an academic topic on African politics or socio-economic development has an element of personal story, observation about how others would eat, not about the subtext of prejudice both about Africa and Africans and the fatherly advice. He showed me great care and love. My very brief but fortunate experience with him as a colleague left me a lasting impression of what a person with such an extraordinary achievement in his field can also be, a personality that impresses an aspiring scholar like me. I didn't know that that night was our last physical meeting, and the conversation we had was the last goodbye. In this speech, in the remaining 5 minutes, I would like to dedicate just at least 3 specific major points, among many others that I would highlight while commemorating Thandika's lifetime achievements. The first one is his conviction and determination to serve Africa and African people. Thandika has a first-hand experience of colonialism. In his extended interview with Dr. Kate Mehiga, published in the Journal of Development and Change, he shared us a first account of what life looked like under British colonialism. An active involvement in an anti-colonial struggle from a young age as a student cost him an 18-month sentencing, which was cut short after 3 months hard labor. In his academic articles, we see not just a person who came of age through those hard times, but also a detailed analysis of how African economies and the well-being of Africans is significantly shaped by the colonial system and the political economic governance. Thandika always emphasized that the initial conditions of African political economy, which indeed varies according to the kind of colonial history and economy, and that which continues to be disregarded by especially the Bretton Woods institutions, which later become like the main decision makers of African developmental trajectory. Thandika continuously challenged stylized facts and ideologically loaded policy prescriptions projected to continental Africa and imposed on African people through neoliberal reforms. Most people talk about the period from 1980s to 2000 as the lost decade, but Thandika characterized them as Africa's Great Depression. The second key issue that I would like to focus on is the knowledge production, knowledge in institutions, especially universities, and interdisciplinary approach. As a scholar with extensive experience of research and intellectual engagement, Thandika was an ardent supporter of independent and rigorous knowledge production in Africa. In his opening address at the LSE, when he accepted the chair of African development, Thandika underscored how the period of structural adjustment program killed the capacity of knowledge production in Africa. The indispensable role that knowledge acquisition and dissemination plays in expanding learning and innovations that are vital for development was initially crippled by the assumption that universities were there only to produce manpower to the newly independent African civil service. But the most drastic blow to African knowledge production came from the law of austerity, the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank in particular, with its narrow and incredibly short-sighted study, promoted and imposed cuts to universities because the rates of return were too low. The World Bank advocated for more education at the expense of tertiary education, and both African governments that were already captive for the World Bank through the conditional laws and the so-called donor communities adopted this position, which led to a serious repercussion on the development potential. In Thandika's words, he said, I quote, "The combination of domestic repression and financial strangulation did a great harm to African universities and education as a whole. And with limited funding and the resources, we know how African countries kind of outsourced their policy-making space, their policy-making practices to international NGOs, scholar experts, which are usually called development assistants or technical assistants, but Thomas Sankara usually called them technical assassins. Thandika stood strong and fought in the multiple onslaught on African knowledge production. As an executive director of CODESFA, he led and coordinated both senior and young African researchers to produce knowledge and policy perspectives that balance the neoliberal ideology. And also as a director of United Nations Research Institute in Social Development, he successfully challenged the narrow perspective of economic growth and development and brought the issue of social policy to the foreground. The third most important topic that we need to learn from Thandika is about his specific engagement in studying the African state. I don't think that I'm exaggerating anything if I say that Thandika is the most consistent scholar that fervently articulated the vicious attack launched on the African state. In one of his lecture notes, he collected the various derogatory characterizations of the African state, particularly by Africanist scholars and African scholars that adhere to the neoliberal paradigm. Some of the terminologies include vampire state, neo-patrimonial state, prebendal state, kleptocratic state, dependent state, petty bourgeois state, predatory state, ethnocratic state, pseudo-socialist state, sultanic state, crony state, bloated state, overextended state, parastate state. Thandika successfully debunked both the ideological orientation that nullified and vilified the developmental role of the African state, as well as the empirical fallacy upon which such characterizations were built on, particularly his most important articles, Thinking About Developmental States in Africa, the 2001, and the 2015 article, Neo-Patrimonialism and the Political Economy of Economic Performance in Africa, Critical Reflections, not only open our eyes about how scholarship about the African state has completely misrepresented such hard facts and the reality on the ground. Thandika also showed us how hegemonic knowledge thrives on by discrediting alternative insights. The fate of hegemonic thinking, projected primarily by neoclassical and neoliberal economics, actively produced a capable and developmental African state as an existence, as a non-credible alternative to what they fervently promote, that is a night watchman's state, whose primary task is just facilitating the private sector-led development through regulatory arms. I believe one of the manifestations of this set of thinking in present-day Africa is the extraordinary dominance of the discourse about entrepreneurship, individual and private sector-led innovation as a panacea of Africa's development. Even in this period of time, the same vilified image of African state persists, and ideas about private sector-led entrepreneurship and innovation remain at the center. In his articles that covered almost every aspect of socio-economic and political development, Thandika reminded us of that this is ahistorical to keep the state out of the equation of development. There is no country in this world that has achieved effective domestic resource mobilization, meaningful technological advancement and innovation, sustained economic growth and structural transformation without an active role of a capable developmental state. too bad that Thandika is no longer around to further expand on his topic, particularly taking the present-day Ethiopia, the country which he believed he has influenced. Its developmental orientation has now fallen to the traps of neoliberal reform. Now the World Bank and the IMF are dictating the course of rolling back the state and unleashing a private sector levels and effectively rendering Ethiopia a choiceless democracy, to use one of Thandika's powerful terminologies. Finally, my advice for my students, fellow Africans, and everyone who's interested in African development in the idea of celebrating Thandika's intellectual legacy is that let's not fall to the games of the 21st century imperialism. Let's not miss the subtext imperial discourse in Africa that is currently being promoted through ideas and practice of entrepreneurship. Yes, we need to encourage industriousness and operations of access in an enabling environment. However, this shouldn't be considered as a replacement of the or through mechanisms that glorify the market as the main distributor of resources. Both Africa's initial conditions and the present-day reality demand a capable and active developmental state. Thandika, you will always be with us through what you have achieved, and you will always be with us in inspiring our ideas and perspectives. Rest in power. I thank you. I can't hear you, Jonathan. I don't know whether it's me or... I don't know, I still can't hear you. Am I the only one or?
Hi, Eyob. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, you can hear me. Fantastic. I was just going to say thank you, Eyob, for the heartfelt and powerful words about Thandika and how we must continue as Africans and as part of the diaspora to build on his groundbreaking contributions. Despite this being a virtual event, your words were quite tangible, and I did feel them all the way from the LSE campus, from the heart of the campus. I would just like to say to all the attendees and participants that we also apologize on behalf of the team for the delay for the book launch session. However, please stay in tune with the alerts that we'll be posting, and due to technical difficulties, we'll be getting that to commence soon. Thank you, Eyob, and thank you everyone for partaking.
Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate it.